Okay, so today's shiur I'm really not confident about, and we're gonna rely heavily on like you guys thinking and like asking questions and making comments. Okay, not that we don't do that in general, but this time I'm not confident about it. So the title of the shiur I'm not decided on. I think what I called it in the shiur description was R Yitzchak Kanpanton versus Ralph Waldo Emerson on how a thinker reads the words of Chachamim. I'm thinking of okay, so that's the sloppy title of the shiur. The topic of the shiur, I think actually this occurred to me as I was walking to yeshiva this morning. I think I want to make this a shiur about Emunas Chachamim. Okay, and that's how I decided to frame it. Okay, so let's just really quickly like introduce it with Emunas Chachamim. So as we know, there is a minhag to read Pirkei Avos to learn Pirkei Avos between Pesach and Shavuos, and one parak each week after Pesach. And I know this is not the right parak. This is parak Vav, which is not technically part of Pirkei Avos. It's really from Avos to Rabbi Nassan, which is the brisa on Mesachas Avos, but they added it to Pirkei Avos to make the minhag have the right number of prakim. So it says, this is Vav Vav. Gedola Torah Yosef min HaKahuna u'min HaMalchus. Torah is greater than Kahuna and the priesthood and Malchus, the kingship. Shamalchus niknes bishloshi malos. Kingship is acquired with 30 virtues, privileges, however you want to say it. V'HaKahuna be'esrim v'arba. Kahuna is acquired with 24. Okay. But Torah niknes ba'arbaim u'shmona dvarim. Torah is acquired through 48 things. Now, what that whole part of the Mishnah means, I don't really care. I'm just showing you where we see the phrase. Okay, so then it goes through and lists all the things you need to get Torah. So Talmud, which is learning, obviously, depending how you say Talmud, Shmias Ozen, listening with the ear, Arichas Vasayim, etc. Goes on and on and on. One of these things is Emunas Chachamim. Okay, you need Emunas Chachamim in order to acquire Torah. Okay, so it's a term that people use a lot. And the question is, what does it mean? Now, I'll tell you what it doesn't mean, okay? I don't think, is there is a type of Emunas Chachamim in the sense of relying on the Masorah. Like, we have Torah Sheba'al Peh that was given to Moshe at Sinai and passed down, from generation to generation. And that's the way that we know how to keep the mitzvos. So when it says eye for an eye, we know that does not mean you poke out the guy's eye. We know it means a monetary penalty. Or when it says pri etz hadar, we know that means an esrog. Or when it says totafot, we know that means tefillin. So you might think that Emunas Chachamim means trusting the Masorah. I don't think it means that, because first of all, if you don't trust the Masorah, not only will you not acquire Torah, you're considered a kofar b'Torah and you lose your chelik in olam haba. I don't think that's the type of emunah that we're talking about here. So this is something which is like not an absolute requirement. This is talking about like something that you need in order to master Torah. So it's like a perfection of Emunas Chachamim. So what do you think?
I'm sorry, what distinction did you just make? That if you don't believe in perfect, you have to say it again. Sorry.
Yeah, if you deny Torah Sheba'al Peh, like you deny the Masorah in any area, so then that makes you a kofar b'Torah and you have no chelik in olam haba. So I don't think that's what this is talking about, because this is talking about qualities you need in order to acquire Torah, whereas believing in the Masorah is like a basic thing that makes you a Jew, So I don't think this is talking about believing in the Masorah. Yeah. So what might Emunas Chachamim mean? You want me to tell you one more thing it doesn't mean? Let me narrow it down. Okay, here's another thing it doesn't mean. Okay, it does not mean that you just accept whatever Chazal say. Now, how do we know it doesn't mean that?
Maybe because they contradict each other.
Okay, so that's number one, right? Is they contradict each other. So you can't just believe whatever they say because you can't believe a contradiction, right? Okay, that's good. So there's lots of arguments you could give as to why we don't just accept what someone says blindly. If you want a really good discourse on this, Avram ben Ramam in his drasha, in his essay on midrashim, talks about why we don't just accept what Chazal say, like just blindly, in terms of their interpretations of things. Again, when it comes to the Masorah, when it comes to the data of the Masorah, you have to rely on that. But when it comes to like, I don't know, like a machlokas beis Hillel beis Shammai, we don't just say, well, we believe both of them, right? We argue it out, right? And not we, but the Chachamim who were involved in establishing the halacha, they duke it out, and that's the entire process of learning involves people challenging each other on claims that are made, and Rashi, Ramban has the utmost respect for Rashi, but you look through the Ramban's commentary on Chumash, and many times he'll say, okay, this is what Rashi says, and I disagree, or I think that this is ridiculous, or I think that this doesn't make any sense, So the whole way of learning that we have, whether it's in the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Gaonim, the Rishonim, the Achronim, it's all based on critically examining what Chazal say and trying to understand it. And if you have an argument against it, then voicing the argument. So this is not advocating blind acceptance of whatever Chazal say. Okay, so that's narrowing it down. So it doesn't mean just accepting the raw data of the Masorah, nor does it mean blindly accepting whatever any Chacham says. So what might it mean?
Maybe like that if you don't understand something, you give it you accept that it's something that's been said with Chachma, and you investigate to understand what it means instead of saying like that doesn't make any sense. And
exactly. Okay, exactly. All right. So that's what I think it means also. Okay, and I'm going to show you what I think is the clearest exposition on this virtue of Emunas Chachamim. Okay, so this is R Yitzchak Kanpanton. He was a late Rishon who lived a surprisingly long life, 1360 to 1463. Okay, lived 103 years. Okay, pretty good. He wrote I believe this is considered to be the first or one of the first methodology guides on how to learn Gemara. Okay, and when I say methodology, I mean he has how you should go about thinking and learning. And he also has like a glossary of terms and how the Gemara's terms are used and like what to take from them. So this is, I'm just pulling out one paragraph from here where he doesn't actually invoke the term Emunas Chachamim, but this is what he says is my understanding of Emunas Chachamim. So he says like this, and now bear in mind, he's talking about learning Gemara, but I think this applies equally to learning Mefarshim, learning works of philosophy from the Chachamim, and not just Rishonim and Achronim, but also not just Tanaim and Amoraim, but also Rishonim and Achronim and all Chachamim. So he says like this: "B'tchilas iyunecha, at the beginning of your analysis, tasim b'munach b'machshavtecha, then you should establish as a basis or a principle in your thoughts. Ki kol echad mehamedabrim, echad hashov, echad hameshiv." You should have in mind that every one of the speakers, whether it's the questioner or the responder, that they are intelligent people. Balei seichel, they have a seichel, they have intellect. V'shekol divreihem b'chachma uvitfuna uvada'as, and all of their words were said with wisdom and with understanding and with knowledge. Ein behem niftal v'ikesh, and they don't have any perversion or distortion in them. V'hachi amrinan, this is what it says in the Gemara Shavuos, Daf Mem Ches Amud Beis. Atu b'shaftani askinan. So the Gemara there is going in and analyzing, different things that were said by Chachamim, and I guess there's a motion to reject something that someone says, and the Gemara responds, "Are we dealing with fools?" And it's a rhetorical question, meaning obviously we're not dealing with fools. He must have meant something intelligent. Therefore, therefore you must analyze all of their words, veliros, and to see whether they are statements of reasoning that are healthy and strong as a polished mirror. Okay, and if you think that that's a weird phrase, it comes from Eov. Back then, mirrors were made out of metal. Okay, so we're talking about something that is hammered out, that is strong material and smooth and reflective. Okay, so is this statement something that is strong and has reason? Im tafel bli melach, or is it like bread without salt? Okay, udavarim chalushim, and weak statements. Okay, the imhim davarim hamiskarvim el seichel umisrachkim. Is it things that are intellectually, literally close to the intellect, meaning like intellectually probable, or are they misrachkim, or are they things that the intellect distances itself from, or things that are improbable? And you must strive to bring their words close, okay, to the intellect. ulataknam, and to correct them or perfect them or fix them, be'inyan, in a way, sheyihu neosim umiskablim, so that they are beautiful and acceptable, umiskarvim etzel hasechal, and probable to the intellect. V'shelo lases v'lases alehem avon ashma shel svara ra'ua o chalusha. There's actually another gear set that says avon ve'ashma, and you should not project onto them or place or attribute to them the sin and guilt of a shaky svara, of a shaky explanation, or chalusha, or a weak explanation. Ki lo nafel mikol divrehem arza. None of their words should fall to the earth. Ki kulam divrei elokim chaim. All of them are the words of the living God. V'im reiku mikemhu. If they are empty, then it's from you. Pause there for 1 second. So let me just quote the actual drasha that he's saying. So there's a pasuk in Dvarim talking about Torah that says, "Ki lo davar reiku mikem." It is not an empty matter from you. It's talking about the Torah. Ki hu chayehem, for it is your life. Uvadavar hazeh tarichu yamim al hadama. And with this matter, with this thing, then your days will be prolonged on the earth. Asher atem ovrim as hayarden sham l'rishta, which you're crossing the Jordan to inherit it. Okay. So the drasha in Yushalmi Pea Aleph He says, or sorry, Aleph Aleph says kilo davar reku. So the extra word here is mikem, right? The pasuk could have just said the Torah is not an empty thing. What does it mean? It's not an empty thing from you. So the Gemara darshans kilo davar reku. It is not an empty thing. V'im reku, and if it is empty, mikemhu. That's from you, meaning that it's only empty because you're lacking something. V'lama, and why? Why are you finding it to be empty? Because you're not exerting yourself in Torah. Okay, so so he says that's how you should view the words of these Chachamim, that if you find the words to be lacking, then you should assume it comes from you. V'zehu sha'amru, and this is what Chazal mean when they say me'ikara my savar ulavasof my savar. What did he hold initially, and what does he hold in the end? What we call the hava amina and the maskana. Okay, so again, I've never seen at all. I mean, I think those of us who have been learning in an analytical method are familiar with this from experience, but I've never seen any Rishon like spell it out so beautifully and clearly that you when you approach Chazal, you assume that all their words were said with seichel, and you do what we there's the straw man fallacy, where you take their position, you take your opponent's position, and you create like a simplistic caricature of it, and you attack the caricature. And then the opposite of that, I've heard it called the okay, wait, I'm blanking. Is it Iron Man? Steel Man, not Iron Man. Iron Man's the Marvel Avenger, but Steel Man, which is when you take the position, and instead of like creating a simplified version which highlights its distortions, you make the best case possible for the words in a way that makes sense. Okay, and here's the thing: is he's not saying that everything Chazal say is correct, and he's not even saying that you have to like end the day with everything making sense. I mean, he says you have to assess: are these statements of reason that are strong, or are they unsalted bread and weak, or are they probable intellectually, or are they improbable, or so in other words, you are trying to make the best case possible because your assumption is that these are words of Chachma. And just before I call on Avital, just to summarize this in the terms from the Mishnah, Emunas Chachamim people translate as faith in the Chachamim. I would translate it as faith that they are Chachamim. Okay. In other words, when you learn, then you must assume that the Rambam was a Chacham. You must assume that Rashi was a Chacham. And if you see a problem with what they're saying, like, assume that the fault is within you. In fact, I was giving a shiur, and I still don't know whether I was too harsh in responding this way, but I was giving a shiur on the Rambam, and what the Rambam said didn't seem to make sense. And someone in the shiur said, well, the Rambam was a minority opinion anyway. And I just blurted out, I think because I'd been thinking about this, I blurted out, I said, let me ask you a question. Do you think the Rambam is an idiot? And the person was like taken aback. And I said, no. So the fact that the Rambam was a minority opinion, like, fine, he was a minority opinion. It means that the other Chachamim didn't agree with him. But the Rambam had reasons for what he said. And if you think that you spotted a question that the Rambam somehow didn't see, then you're the idiot. I didn't say that, but like that's what I was thinking, you know. So that's like Emunas Chachamim, according to my understanding. Okay, Avital, what did you want to say or ask?
I just had a question in terms of like, I always feel like this is kind of murky. Like when you talk about like Emunas Chachamim, what is it like? Who does it like? Is it a certain time period that it applies to? Is it somebody who I have to think is smart? Like what is like Chachamim when you define it? Like how would you?
That's the difficult thing, right? So who is a Chacham in this context? I'll tell you a story from my early years in yeshiva. And I'm not going to tell you which sefer this was about, but two fathers in the yeshiva community both decided to learn a certain popular sefer written by one of the Achronim that's like learning in a lot of yeshivas. They decided to learn it with their sons. I think their sons like both wanted to learn it with their fathers. So they were both learning the same sefer. And then I heard them talking about it on Shabbos, okay? And one of them said, yeah, we were learning it and we found a contradiction and we were like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Let's learn something else. And then the other person said, oh, we also saw the same contradiction. So we tried working it out and we arrived at a beautiful idea, you know? And I was like, you know, who's right? I mean, if this idea, I didn't ask them what the idea was, but like, if the idea that they arrived at was genuinely in what the Chacham was saying, like, then the first guy was like really wrong to just give up on it. And I wanted to say to the guy, again, this is my first, you know, years in yeshiva, and I wasn't so bold to like go up to like these senior chachamim, but I if I was there again, I would say, like, you know, would you have done this if I told you that this was a statement of the Rambam, or if this is a statement of the Rosh Yeshiva? Probably not. They probably would have like tried to like understand it, you know? So the answer to your question, Avital, is I think you have to go based on reputation, you know, like, if you are an expert, you can assess other people and tell whether they are an expert based on firsthand knowledge. But if you're not an expert, I'm not just talking about in Torah, I'm talking about any area. Let's say like in medicine, if you're a doctor, you can evaluate other doctors within your field, you know, by looking at their decisions and their work, etc. But if you're not, you kind of have to rely on the reputation of other people that you trust. You know, and so I think a lot of it does have to do with reputation, and there are sometimes machloksim about like whether a given, you know, person, again, I'm not going to name names, but like prominent figures I know are revered by some people as great chachamim and other people as like delusional like idiots, you know, and you know, I guess you have to like rely on the testimony of the people whose chachma you yourself have seen. Like, in other words, if you have certain teachers or people who are greater chachamim than you, and they endorse a certain chacham, then that's a good indication that that person is a chacham. And if they're skeptical about it, then maybe you should be skeptical. And if they say, oh, this person is like a charlatan, then, you know, you can assume that they're a charlatan. So I don't think there's like a clear-cut litmus test.
Can I add something to that?
Sorry, Avital, what were you saying?
Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say like that. Let's say like I grew up only in the place that I grew up, obviously. So like that's gonna have like certain biases, or like, let's say I'm not Hasidic, but they seem to have different rabbeim, and like it's just hard to draw these distinctions between like, oh, like when people say stuff, especially when you're having conversations with other people who have other rabbis, like, oh, like I don't think that's true, but you think that's true because of Emunas Chachamim that I'm lacking or have, that, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. So that's a valid point, which is that you also have to realize Ezehu Chacham Halomin Mikol Adam. That's in Pirkei Avos 4. Is that this week's Pirkei Avos? I don't know. I'm not doing it according to the weeks. But you have to be able to learn from everyone and be able to recognize that Chachma can come from anywhere, and you know, and be open to exposing yourself to areas of Chachma that you have not had experience with, you know. And also recognizing that a person could be a chacham in one area and not in another area, you know? So like, yeah, it is difficult. Esty had a follow-up on that, and then Fega has a comment that she's waiting for. Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, in two general guidelines that I use that both come from Torah.
Yeah.
One is Koheles himself, when he introduces Koheles, says that he's Ben David and he was Melech in Yerushalayim. And I heard Rabbi Tate explain that he is basically, he's explaining his credentials and why you should trust him, which is that he is the son of David, so he grew up in a, like, he had a good Masorah, and that he also was a king, which gave him certain types of experiences that were like validating credentials, and that he was in Yerushalayim, which was like one of the pinnacles of society. So like you have to look at a person and see what their credentials are, because you can help you determine.
Yeah.
And then the other source that I always use for myself in this situation is in the Megillah, when Zeresh and Haman's followers are giving him bad advice. It says Zeresh v'ohavav, and then when they say to him, but if he's from Zer Yehudim, then you're going to fall, and it says Zeresh v'chachamav. And Rabbi Che pointed out for that also that it could be like a Russia, but if he knows what he's talking about, there's still chachma there. So these are two sources that I use for myself just to anchor the points that you were making.
That's good. That's a good call. Okay, Fega.
Hi. So this is actually Fega's sister Rivka. Fega
hi, Rivka.
has a question. Hi, thank you for the shiur. My question is bread without salt equivalent to rake? As in, if we detect bread without salt, is the problem with us, or is the problem ever in
That's a good question. Right. So the way I was reading it is that that he's giving a possibility of something that has like see, it's funny because he's saying he contrasts it with statements that have reason that are strong, or like bread without salt, right? So which seems to be something that's like lacking reason. Like here, in other words, the spices seem to be like the reason, and he is saying that you should assess whether it is in the first category or the second category. So the way I'm viewing it is, you go there, you see the statement, it looks like it's bread without salt. But then you should assume that it's reiku mikem, that the emptiness comes from you, and you should keep on analyzing it, and then see whether it actually is bread without salt or whether it is statements of reason. Now, if you get to the end of your analysis and you still are looking at it as bread without salt, so then you kind of have to make a judgment call, which is like, am I convinced that I've gotten to the depths of this? In which case I can say that, like, okay, I assumed that the emptiness was from me, but I now see that it's really not. Like, this statement really is like empty or wrong. Or am I not on the level, and I'm assuming that there is some idea here that I'm just missing, And I think you have to know yourself, and you have to know the chacham who you're addressing like that. For example, again, I keep using the Rambam because, I like the Rambam and I think it's a chacham, but like, if the Rambam says something that doesn't make sense, and I try working it out, and I've tried for years and years and years, and it still doesn't make sense, I still assume that the emptiness is from me. In contrast, if I am in shul and I find a Devar Torah that was written by like some community member, and it doesn't make sense, I'm going to look for a reason, but then I'm going to very quickly conclude, like, if there's no reason there, like, okay, this guy like doesn't know what he's talking about, and then there's everywhere in between. So to answer your question, like, I think you should always go with the assumption that the emptiness is from yourself, but at a certain point, if you have toiled to try to find the reasoning and you still haven't found it, then you have to like make an assessment of like, do I think that I have gotten to the depths of this thing and can make a definitive statement, or am I not on the level to say that yet?
Thank you.
Yep.
So I actually also have a question. This is very good. Yeah. So, hi. So, I'm thinking of like this one book in particular. It's called Oz v'Hadar Levusha, if you've heard of it. It's like, it's
my favorite book.
Oh yeah. I know the pasuk in Mishlei though.
It's like it's a Haredi book about tznius that like has no sources, and like goes really like, above and beyond.
For example, the equivalent of Torah study for a man is tznius for a woman, but it's very hard to find a source that says that.
Okay. Right.
It's like very, it's very, very dedicated to tznius. Anyways, so it has like no sources. It puts a lot of
extra restrictions.
And it doesn't, but it has a haskama from Rav Ovadia Yosef. So I don't think that the author of this book, Rabbi Eliyahu Falk, I believe from England, is really like, I don't necessarily think he knows what he's talking about, just because there's no sources, and it's a lot of like, where did he get that from?
Right.
Oh no, that was before. Seatbelts are allowed.
Unlike the Rambam.
Yeah. Anyways, so I don't think that he knows what he's talking about necessarily, but Rav Ovadia Yosef for sure knew. So I'm just like,
well, here's the thing. Yeah. Okay. So I don't know how to say this without possibly like casting aspersions on Rav Ovadia Yosef, but I'm saying this to be Dan L'Kav Zechus on Ovadia Yosef, which is that, and I'm saying this because I know that this is the case. Unfortunately, it is lately a widespread practice that people get haskamos from, but just to define terms in case anyone's listening, it doesn't. Haskama is like an approbation. Approbation is the right word, right? I think like that you have someone like endorsing a greater authority endorsing the book at the very beginning of the book, and I think this was actually I don't know if it's a halacha or a like one of these like later takanas that you can't publish books until you have a haskama from a chacham. I don't. My point is that it's a real thing. Like there's a real basis for this. So unfortunately, though, it's become a widespread practice that that either that gedolim will give a haskama to a book that they haven't read the book, and they're just doing it based on knowledge of the person or knowledge of like, you know, where the person comes from. Or even worse, I mean, this was a case where like, you know, certain gedolim who were very, very, very old, their secretaries or whatever, for like political reasons, would be like putting these books in front of them and like having them like sign their name to these haskamos, you know? So my answer is, again, I don't want to say that Ovadia Yosef was like wrong in his character judgment or like manipulated or whatever, but I do know Ovadia Yosef knows all sources. That's his thing, right? So like, if what you're saying is true, that this book doesn't really have sources, and if he gave a haskama, I can only help but conclude that he must have just given a haskama based on knowledge of the person or of hearsay, or he was something must have happened, you know? So, but you're pointing out something which is important in my answer to Avital, which is that like, yeah, you can't even rely on endorsements all the time. Like maybe the person doesn't know, you know, doesn't know this person very well, you know, or hasn't read the works. So yeah, it's hard.
So do you know if there is any way to know which haskamos are like legit and which are not?
Well, here's the thing. I think if you read the haskama, right, and you know, certain haskamas will say that like the person will say, I have read through this entire book and it's amazing, right? And unless you're going to say that they're a liar, then I think you can assume that they read through the book, you know? Like I'll give you an example of this, is that one time I was looking at this point in the Tanya, and I was questioning a footnote about like, you know, like a commentary in the Tanya about whether this reflects like the Chabad's actual authority, like this is the Chabad position, or maybe this is just the guy who wrote it, you know? And then in the Haskama, it says that the Lubavitcher Rebbe reviewed all of the commentary, you know? So I assume that that's true, you know? But if the Haskama says something like, oh, like I know this person and he's Yarei Shamayim and he's like, you know, a Talmid Chacham, then I don't know if that means that they read the whole thing. I don't think there's like one way to like find out. And look, if the person's alive and you could ask him, then ask him, you know, like, but yeah. Okay, let's move on. These are good questions, but we have a lot to cover because we haven't gotten to the main course yet. Okay, so what we see here is Emunas Chachamim, just to reiterate, is conviction that the Chachamim were Chachamim, okay, and that you should proceed accordingly. You should assume that all of their words have reasons and think into them deeply, and assume that if it doesn't make sense, it comes from you, and try to make things as you should steelman their words and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't mean that you automatically believe them. And it doesn't mean even that they can't be wrong. Certainly they can be wrong, but it means you try it to the utmost of your ability to make sense of their words, assuming that they're Chachamim. Okay, so that's Emunas Chachamim. Now, what I want to do is I want to contrast that with this speech that I have read now twice. I mean, I've read more than twice, but I've read it in two periods. I read it last year and I read it this year, called The American Scholar, okay, by Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American transcendentalist philosopher, okay. And this edition says, this address was delivered at Cambridge in 1837 before the Harvard chapter of Phi Beta Kappa Society, a college fraternity composed of the first 25 men in each graduating class. The society has annual meetings, which have been the occasion for addresses from the most distinguished scholars and thinkers of the day. Now, the speech in print is 14 pages. I was initially going to read through all of it and like we would discuss it, and I realized it would be too long. So what I've done is I've gone through and bolded the phrases that I think are most germane to this topic, and I want to just read them and talk about them with you. And this is where like I need participation in questions, because this is something that I think some of what he says applies to how we read the Chachamim in our Masorah, and some of it does not. And I think it's a really interesting question, which aspects of his advice here are we would endorse and say like, yeah, you should use this when you're like learning Chumash and with Rashi, or which ones we would say no, when it's, when we're talking about the Bali Masorah, it's a different story. Okay, so that's kind of the question I have in mind here. Okay, so we're going to read through again. We're not reading the whole speech, and you can't get everything if you don't read the whole speech, but we're going to read certain highlighted portions. Now, the first part is, and feel free to jump in with any other thoughts you have that are vaguely related, because should be a discussion. Okay, first part though has nothing to do with reading Chachamim. This is his thesis though. Okay, and again, this is Emerson. He's writing in 1800s, so it's a little bit poetic American transcendentally. Okay, so I'll try to summarize it in plain English. Okay, so this first excerpt is a little long, three paragraphs. The old fable covers a doctrine ever new and sublime. Oh, sorry, I forgot to say what the speech is about. The speech is about we're talking about very early in America's history. And so there was already a model of like the European scholar, or like the English scholar of like, Oxford and Cambridge. So he's trying to propose, what is the American scholar, and what is he and what is he not? Okay. And so he's advocating how he thinks that American thinkers should learn and how they shouldn't, like the pitfalls that are there. Okay. So here's what he says. Here's his thesis. The old fable covers a doctrine ever new and sublime, that there is one man present to all particular men only partially, or through one faculty, and that you must take the whole society to find the whole man. Man is not a farmer or a professor or an engineer, but he is all. Man is priest and scholar and statesman and producer and soldier. In the divided or social state, these functions are parceled out to individuals, each of whom aims to do his stint of the joint work, whilst each other performs his. The fable implies that the individual, to possess himself, must sometimes return from his own labor to embrace all the other laborers. Okay, so pause there for 1 second to just get the fable. I'm not familiar with this fable. If anyone has more knowledge, feel free to weigh in. He's basically saying that, like, human beings can do lots of things, but the way societies work is you divvy it all up. You don't have each person doing all tasks, because you couldn't have a society that way. You have this person who specializes in farming, this person who specializes in medicine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They all work together, but they're all working together should kind of be viewed as one organism. We're all one human being, dividing all tasks that make human life possible. Okay, that's like the ideal state. Okay, but unfortunately, he says, this original unit, this fountain of power, has been so distributed to multitudes, has been so minutely subdivided and peddled out, that it is spilled into drops and cannot be gathered. The state of society is one in which the members have suffered amputation from the trunk and strut about so many walking monsters, a good finger, a neck, a stomach, an elbow, but never a man. Okay, so he's bemoaning, I guess, the modern term for this is like specialization, where you have people who are only capable of doing what they do and are not actually like living as human beings, of partaking in everything. And this is where he's going to get into the thesis now. Okay, if that doesn't make sense to you, this is the part we're going to focus on. And if you can see the screen, he capitalizes the word man a lot. Okay, so when I say man, think capital. Man is thus metamorphosed into many things. The planter, who is man sent out into the field to gather food, is seldom cheered by any idea of the true dignity of his ministry. He sees his bushel and his cart and nothing beyond, and sinks into the farmer instead of man on the farm. The tradesman scarcely ever gives an ideal worth to his work, but is ridden by the routine of his craft, and the soul is subject to dollars. The priest becomes a form, the attorney a statute book, the mechanic a machine, the sailor a rope of the ship. Okay, so pause here for a second. So I'm going to express this in Torah terms. Okay, we hold that each human being is created b'tselem Elokim. Okay, you have a b'tselem Elokim. You are a truth-seeking intellect, a rational animal, and that's who you are. Okay. However, because we live in a world with physical needs, you have to do certain jobs. So you might have to become a farmer, right? And you spend your life farming, or you might have to become an attorney, right? But here's the thing: is we hold that when you're a farmer, you should not be merely a man on a. You should not be merely a farmer. You should be a b'tselem Elokim who happens to be farming. okay? Or you should be Tselem Elokim, who happens to like be a janitor, or Tselem Elokim, who happens to be a chef, you know? That really your essence is you are a human being, but you're contributing your part to society in the way that you labor, okay? Does that make sense? Anyone need clarification on that? Because he's going to drop the bomb in the next paragraph.
Makes sense.
Okay. So he says like this: in this distribution of functions, the scholar is the delegated intellect. In the right state, he is man thinking, capital M, capital T. In the degenerate state, when the victim of society, he tends to become a mere thinker, or still worse, the parrot of other men's thinking. Okay. So he's saying like this: there are 3 levels. So in the same way that a human being who has a Tselem Elokim, who farms, can be reduced to just being a farmer, where he says the planter he sees his bushel and his cart and nothing beyond, and sinks into the farmer instead of man on the farm. There you are basically like a beast of burden. You're basically like an animal who is just plowing, just like your ox plows, and you're not thinking. Okay, and that's bad. So too, even people who are involved in the world of thinking can become a scholar, okay, with a frowny face, okay, that what he's calling a mere thinker instead of man thinking, and he's saying even worse, the parrot of other men's thinking. Okay, and what I want to understand here is like, what is this difference between man thinking, which is the ideal state, mere thinker, which is the degenerate state, and then the parrot of other men's thinking, which is the worst?
What's the middle one?
The middle one is a mere thinker. No capital M and capital T. So anyone have any ideas what these 3 levels are?
Out there.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think so. The first, like the base level, the one that's the worst, I would imagine, is somebody who's kind of, so parrot just makes me think of copying. So kind of like taking other people's ideas and trying to like, you know, put them together, but not really doing any individual kind of thinking. Yeah. And then the middle level could potentially be somebody who's thinking, but isn't necessarily putting ideas together and having a basis for argument.
Okay, good.
Just like a bunch of ideas, but nothing necessarily linked, whereas like the final level, like the idea level, is thinking individually with consistent thought patterns and like making genuine cases for yourself and like linking up ideas.
Okay, good. I'm gonna agree with you, and then just state one thing in a little bit more of a severe way, which I don't know if this is a disagreement with you or if this is in line. So what do parrots do? Parrots repeat words without understanding. Okay, so a parrot of other men's thinking is just regurgitating stuff that he's heard. Okay, so he's not even thinking. Okay, a mere thinker is thinking, but he's not thinking any of his own original thoughts. He's just thinking what other people think. Okay, and I think that's what you meant by like not putting things together, right? Yeah. Meaning, yeah. And then man thinking with capital M, capital T is actually engaging in original firsthand thinking on their own.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Anyone have any additions or disagreements?
Yeah, just an addition. So far, the way we've been talking about like man with capital M has been someone who's more than just what he is, that he kind of goes broader and is connecting all of these other like positions that you can have in the world. So I think that man thinking is also kind of connecting more than just.
Okay. I'm almost upset that you said that, because there's a whole great thing where he talks about this, which I really want to go into. In fact, I'm going to read it, even though I'm not going to go into it. I was upset because I didn't plan on going into it. And I'm going to read it anyway. Just, it's so good. Okay. So he's talking. So he goes into the next part of his, actually, sorry, let me actually ask, does anyone have any more thoughts on that triple distinction here? Okay. So the speech is divided into 4 parts. Okay. He has the 3 main influences of man thinking, okay, which is nature, books, and experience. And we're going to focus primarily on books. And then he goes into like practical ramifications. All right. So I wanted to skip over the part about nature, but listen to this, since Maya mentioned like making connections. So this is just this great description of like what someone who is thinking does. Now he's talking about nature, but I think this would also apply to other areas. It's like Torah. Nature hastens to render account of herself to the mind. Classification begins. To the young mind, everything is individual, stands by itself. And by and by it finds how to join two things and see in them one nature, then three, then 3,000. And so tyrannized over by its own unifying instinct, it goes on tying things together, diminishing anomalies, discovering roots running underground, whereby contrary and remote things cohere and flower out of one stem. It presently learns that since the dawn of history, there has been a constant accumulation and classifying of facts. But what is classification but the perceiving that these objects are not chaotic, are not foreign, but have a law, which is also the law of the human mind. The astronomer discovers that geometry, a pure abstraction of the human mind, is the measure of planetary motion. The chemist finds proportions and intelligible method throughout matter, and science is nothing but the finding of analogy, identity in the most remote parts. The ambitious soul sits down before each refractory fact, one after another reduces all strange constitutions, all new powers to their class and their law, and goes on forever to animate the last fiber of organizations, the outskirts of nature by insight. So that's like this type of like classification and making connections that I suspect Maya was talking about. This is also why I like the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, because the Rambam does this with all of Torah. Okay, but that's a side plug. Okay, so now let's talk about how a man thinking reads books. Now remember, Emerson is going to be talking about warnings. Okay, so it's going to start off by sounding like he's really saying books are bad, but that's because he's trying to talk about like the bad way you can relate to books. Okay, so he says like this: the theory of books is noble. The scholar of the first age received into him the world around, brooded thereon. Brooded here does not mean like an angsty teen. Brooded means like thought. Gave it the new arrangement of his own mind and uttered it again. It came into him life. It went out from him truth. It came to him short-lived actions. It went out from him immortal thoughts. It came to him business. It went out from him poetry. It was dead fact. It is now quick thought. It can stand and it can go. It now endures. It now flies. It now inspires. Precisely in proportion to the depth of mind from which it issued, so high does it soar, so long does it sing. So this is talking about the person who is man thinking, who has these insights and like takes, these dead facts and like thinks about them and then it animates them and it becomes like this living thing. Okay, this is all like thumbs up. Okay, but then he says, each age, again, I'm skipping a lot here. Okay, each age it is found must write its own books, or rather each generation for the next succeeding. The books of an older period will not fit this. So this is our first note of sounding like he's speaking anti-Masorah. He's saying like, you need to write a new book in each generation because you can't really rely on the old. Okay, but why not? So he goes on to explain. He says, yet hence arises a grave mischief. The sacredness which attaches to the act of creation, the act of thought, is instantly transferred to the record. The poet chanting was felt to be a divine man. Henceforth, the chant is divine also. The writer was a just and wise spirit. Henceforward, it is settled that the book is perfect, as the love of the hero corrupts into worship of his statue. Instantly, the book becomes noxious. The guide is a tyrant. We sought a brother, and lo, a governor. The sluggish and perverted mind of the multitude, always slow to open to the incursions of reason, having once received the book, stands upon it and makes an outcry if it is disparaged. Colleges are built on it. Books are written on it by thinkers, not by man thinking, by men of talent. That is, who start wrong, who set out from accepted dogmas, not from their own side of principles. Meek young men grow up in libraries, believing it is their duty to accept the views which Cicero, which Locke, which Bacon have given, forgetful that Cicero, Locke, and Bacon were only young men in libraries when they wrote these books. Hence, instead of man thinking, we have the bookworm. Hence, the book learned class, who value books as such, not as related to nature and a human constitution, but as making a sort of third estate with the world and soul. Hence, the restorers of readings, the emendators, the bibliomaniacs of all degrees. This is bad. This is worse than it seems. One more thing, and then we'll summarize. Books are the best of things, well used. Abused, among the worst. What is the right use? What is the one end by which all means go to effect? They are for nothing but to inspire. I had better never see a book than to be warped by its attraction clean out of my own orbit and made a satellite instead of a system. Okay, now that was a lot. And chances are, if this is your first time reading it, then you're not going to get everything the first time. But what did you sense is the problem he's describing here about what happens when a real thinker writes a book and what happens to the book afterwards, which becomes harmful?
essentially what happens a lot is that when someone who's smart writes a book, everyone is like, oh, well, then this must be objective truth.
Right.
And whatever I think is automatically wrong.
Yeah.
And it leads to a lot of people not trusting their own brains.
Exactly. Okay. Well said. Well said. Anyone want to add to that?
Yeah, I want to add to that too. I mean, what I got from it also was when people write, hold on, sorry.
Sure.
Right, people stop thinking of their own initial ideas and taking these facts and like building off of that, and instead they just kind of trust the books as like, these are the dogma, this is what we base ourselves off of.
Okay, good, right. So it actually like becomes an impediment to their own ability to think. Yeah. Anyone else?
I have a question.
Sure.
I just didn't catch, did he say anything with regard to like incorporating or building, or I mean, I understand what you were saying, not to take the ideas just on the basis of the person, but anything about incorporate anything about like forward preservation of ideas that are worthwhile?
It's a good question, right? Because presumably, like if these thinkers just didn't write, then we would lose all of their ideas, and then mankind would be worse off, right? So that's the thing, is he's not condemning the writing of the books, he's condemning how they are taken, and the fact that new books are not written on those same ideas. In other words, that's why he started off by saying, that's why he said, where did he say that books are the best things? Oh yeah, books are the best of things well used, abused among the worst. So he hasn't yet stated how to use the book in a good way. That's going to come later on in the speech. And presumably he holds it's important. Like if you ask him right now, what do you want? He would say, I want thinkers to write their books and readers to read them in ways that don't have these bad effects. But he hasn't yet spelled out what that looks like.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So I want to read you Bruce Lee's version of this, okay, which Bruce Lee writes a lot about this, but he says, I had this quote here. Hold on. Oh yeah, here we go. Yeah, this this paragraph here. This is in the Tao of Jeet Kune Do. So he says the founder of a style. Now he's talking about styles of martial arts. This also applies to styles of music, styles of thinking, original thought in any area. The founder of a style may be exposed to some partial truth, but as time passes by, especially after the founder has passed away, his postulates, his inclination, his concluding formula become a law. Creeds are invented, reinforcing ceremonies are prescribed, separative philosophies are formulated, and finally, the institutions are erected so that what might have started off as some sort of personal fluidity of its founder is now solidified, fixed knowledge, organized and classified response presented in logical order, a preserved cure-all for mass conditioning. In so doing, the well-meaning followers have made this knowledge not only to a holy shrine, but a tomb in which the founder's wisdom is buried. Okay, so that's like the problem that he mentioned at the end about how Cicero and Locke and Bacon, they were young men in libraries reading and thinking and expressing their original fluid flowing thought. Now, they certainly think that their ideas have merit, but the last thing they would want any of their students to do would be to take those ideas and then just say, okay, that was the only correct idea, that was the objective truth, and like we have to stop thinking, we have to like pledge allegiance to the views of Locke, because that's not what they were doing. They were actually like engaged in this thinking. So if their views inspire that same sort of thinking in someone else, and if the truths that they arrived at allow their students to like see light and then take it on and develop it in their own way, that would be like, that's what a real thinker wants for the people who read his books. If a thinker writes a book and just wants everyone to accept his opinion, that's a tyrant. That's not an actual teacher, Okay, so let's go on. And these are not, by the way, these are not distinct points. This is, it's more like painting a portrait here. Okay, so, again, this is going to sound overly harsh. Okay. So he says like this. Oh, so sorry, I forgot one thing. So 2 examples of this in Torah that I'm familiar with. And again, I can only say what I know. Okay. That, the yeshiva that I learned at and teach in, Yeshiva B'nai Torah, was founded by Rabbi Chait. And my understanding, so Rebbe Chait was a student of Rav Soloveitchik, and Rav Soloveitchik was the master of the Brisker Derech HaLimud, right? Is the Brisker, the certain methodology of learning Talmud that was developed by Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, his grandfather. So the Rav had many, many students, and many of them were geniuses and went on to teach, to form their own yeshivas, and to teach their own Torah and to teach the Rav's Torah. But what made our yeshiva unique was that Rabbi Chait not only wanted to teach Torah according to the Rav's methodology, but he wanted to train people in that methodology themselves so that they could do that on their own, So he founded the yeshiva with Rabbi Man to teach the Rav's derech halimud, not just to teach according to the Rav's derech, but to teach people how to think that way on their own independently, and so it is, and so you'll find that there are people who are very good at conveying what the Rav said, but cannot independently think that way on their own, and that's what our yeshiva was founded to try to do, is to equip people with the same tools. And similarly, the way that I see it, again, I can speak from my own experience here, is when we learn Mefarshim on Chumash, we're not just trying to get their ideas. That is definitely what we're trying to do. We're trying to see Chumash through their eyes. We're trying to like what led Rashi to look at the pasuk this way and to learn it this way instead of that way, and that's like what R Yitzchak Kanpanton was saying, is that you have to ask yourself, what was this person thinking? What was the havmim? What was the maskana? Why did he phrase it this way? We're trying to not, I don't mean this in a creepy way. We're trying to get into Rashi's head, to like see the Chumash through his eyes, not just to like take his words and then get the idea. We're trying to the extent that we can never reach, I won't speak for me. I won't speak for you. I'll speak for me. I can never get to the level of being a Rashi, but I can try to get as close as I can to seeing the world through, the Mefarshim's eyes. Okay. Yeah.
Can I ask a question on that?
Sure.
It's kind of similar to Avital's questions before, and we might even get to this, but how are we able to, try to get into Rashi's head and try to try to like get the ideas that the Mefarshim had, but also think on our own terms and like bring our own ideas into it. Like, how are we able to just like kind of get both in that sense? Great question.
So I'm going to give a short answer to that. I think he's going to elaborate a little bit on it later on, but that might be a topic for another shiur. So I'll give you the short answer, which is the more you watch great thinkers think and see how they thought that way, then the more your intuition develops, and then you start to be able to think according to your own mind with a trained intuition. Okay. Like, it's very similar to the old model of apprenticeship. If you're trained to be a blacksmith, you don't just get it from books. You watch the blacksmith operate and you see what it's like, how the blacksmith, treats every single individual case of what he's making. And then you start to develop your own intuition, that is, and I call it intuition because it's not like a formulaic procedure. It's getting a sense for that. And if you do that we're advantageous, Rashi didn't have access to the Rambam. Rashi didn't have access to the Ramban. Rashi didn't have access to like the centuries of Chachamim after him. We at the end have access to centuries of Chachamim, and we can expose ourselves to all these different ways of thinking. And the more we immerse ourselves in different like methodologies and worldviews, the more our own intuition will be trained, and then we'll start to find our own unique like way of looking at things.
Yeah, I like the methodology of training and just viewing it that way.
Yeah.
I have a question on that.
Yes, sure.
I'm thinking like also, doesn't it like can't a person also follow the steps in the argument and then try and figure out what was going on? So not just watching it, but also actively participating in one's own learning to understand what the steps that the Chacham was making are.
Correct. Yeah. And actually in that Yitzchak Kanpanton thing, then he goes through how you should go about doing that. Like one of his methods, which became the bedrock of everything I teach, certainly in Mishlei, is he says, when you're learning the Mefarshim on Chumash, you should not read the Mefarshim. You shouldn't read the pasuk and then read the Mefarshim. You should read the pasuk and then come up with all your own questions and say, how would I interpret this? and then look at the Mefarshim and see what they said, and then compare the way you did it to the way they did it. And then that's how you like get this training. So do as much as you can on your own, and then subject it to the example of the master. Yeah. Okay. So now he says something again, which sounds a little radical. Okay. He says, undoubtedly there is a right way of reading, so it be sternly subordinated. Man thinking must not be subdued by his instruments. Books are for the scholar's idle times. When he can read God directly, the hour is too precious to be wasted in other men's transcripts of their readings. But when the intervals of darkness come, as come they must, when the soul seeth not, when the sun is hid and the stars withdraw their shining, we repair to the lamps which were kindled by their ray, to guide our steps to the east again, where the dawn is. We hear that we may speak. The Arabian proverb says, a fig tree looking on a fig tree becomes fruitful. Yeah, so this is something that I think we would agree with in principle, but slide the dial or the scale all the way to the other end. Okay, what I mean is like this. He's saying when you have the ability to think on your own, that's what you should be doing. And only when you are in a period of darkness, or when you have idle time, then you should rely on other thinkers' thoughts. Okay. I think we put a lot higher of a premium on the value to be gained from what great thinkers have thought. Okay. But there still is a limit to that. Okay. And I'm going to give you an example of this. I'll give you an example I witnessed and an example of myself. Okay. And then you have to apply this to yourself in whatever way you do. Okay. So when I was in yeshiva, in my yeshiva days, the Rosh HaYeshiva gave shiur in the main base midrash. And when he gave shiur, all the people who were in his shiur would go to the main base midrash wherever they were. Now, there was a chavrusa of two chachamim who were former students of the Rosh Yeshiva. And I would always marvel at the fact that when the Rosh Yeshiva gave shiur, these two students would continue their chavrusa, and they did not go to the Rosh Yeshiva's shiur. Okay. And I was thinking to myself, like, why not? Like the Rosh Yeshiva is the greatest chacham in the yeshiva, and you clearly value his Torah because like you were students of his for a very long time. And it took me like a while to get the sense that, okay, it must be that they're gaining more from their own chavrusa than they are from the shiur. Now, is that saying anything about the Rosh Yeshiva? No. In fact, Chazal say, I have learned a lot from my Rebbeim, and I've learned more from my peers, but I've learned the most from my own Talmidim. That greater chachma might be gotten from the Rosh Yeshiva shiur in terms of the quality of the ideas, but greater quality learning in terms of like your own insights and your own growth might come about through your chavrusa. And I respect their decision, just like I respect the decision of other people to go to the Rosh Yeshiva shiur. And someone actually asked me, like I teach in yeshiva in the morning, and then I come back and I to my apartment and I tutor when the other shiurim are going on. So someone said, like, wouldn't you rather be in shiur than teaching? And I thought about it and I was like, yes and no. I mean, I would love to be in my Rebbe's shiur, in Rav Pesach's shiur, but I gain so much from teaching. And if I had to pick, I think I would pick teaching over being in someone else's shiur, And I'm quoting Chazal for this, like, I learn the most from my Talmidim. And so I think there is a tension here, but I would not say that like, this is advisable to like learn on your own and never listen to any other Chacham's Torah and never learn any books, except in your idle times. I wouldn't say it's that far. I think most of our learning does take place through other people's writings. But I think the difference though, is that when he gives this thing, when the thinker can read God directly, for us, that is learning the Masorah and learning the words of the Chachamim. So there's like a meld here, of these two things. We learn Torah, which is God's word, through the lens of the Bali Masorah. So like, I think it's the categories he's working with are different than the categories we're working with. Okay, any thoughts or questions here? Okay, next. I love this part. It is remarkable, the character of the pleasure we derive from the best books. They impress us ever with the conviction that one nature wrote and the same reads. Okay, meaning that the guy who wrote and one who reads they both have the same nature, the same Tselem Elokim.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I actually
Sure.
do have a question.
Yeah.
Okay. So do you have any guidelines? Like I'm listening to what you're saying and what you're reading, and I agree, but I also disagree, because I feel like in my own life, and then also with other people I've encountered, there's a really tough balance to strike, especially when a person's like very enthusiastic about ideas, to balance properly their own ability to learn and understand and come up with chidushim versus chachamim. In other words, a person can have like a lot invested and just think that they're coming up with these things, and these other like very invested in their own ideas when they're actually making tons of going off in a lot of different ways of thinking that are maybe not so actually even just good for their own development in just a very personal way. So how does a person balance that and understand that? How does a person do an internal personal check to make sure that they are on a good derech in terms of their thinking, and whether it's time to listen to themselves or tune to the chachamim?
Right, that's a great question. So I'll give a couple of rules of thumb, but this is certainly not an exhaustive list. So one is that you should have at least one Rebbe, one person who you learn under on a regular basis, who can, who is more knowledgeable than you and who can subject your own ideas and stuff to scrutiny, and also who can subject your developmental path to scrutiny, to see whether you're going off or not, A second thing is that that in areas where there's different ramifications for different ideas. If you're learning a pasuk in Vayikra, I'm not to pick on Vayikra. If you're learning a pasuk in about korbanos, right, and you come up with your own idea and it's a mistake about a detail in korbanos, that's very different than learning Yesodei Torah and making a mistake about God. Or if you are learning something in Mishlei and you arrive at something that suggests a wildly different course of action and decision making that can have drastic consequences, that's very different than learning about an abstract purely theoretical halachic matter. So I would say that the more weighty the conclusion or the idea you arrive at is, then the more subject to scrutiny you should give it. You should subject it to scrutiny in by people who are superior chachamim. And I think if you take the opposite approach, that would be ridiculous. If you run by every idea you come up with, any idea in your own learning, you run it by your Rebbe. I think that's going to stunt your development, and I think it's going to annoy your Rebbe. So weigh it out based on the nature of the area you're doing. So that would be my second piece of advice. And my third piece of advice would be that I think the more you can subject your ideas to any checks, even not by your Rebbe, whether it's to peers or talmidim, then that's going to act as a certain fence. One of the scariest things about after my high school teaching job ended is now every single thing I teach, I record and put it online for everyone to see. And it's scary because I'm subjecting it to whoever listens to it, is gonna see all my mistakes, but it's very good for my development because I know that there are chachamim who listen to what I teach. And I know that if I am making a mistake in a particular, or if I'm veering off track in my general way of learning, someone's going to catch me, so have these safety nets in place. And then the other thing is psychology, whether it's formal psychology or therapy or mindfulness or Mishlei or all these things, keeping tabs on your own emotions to know when you are prone to be thinking with your emotions or when you're letting your ego get to you, and having people having checks on your ego and stuff like that. Those are very important also. And I've seen not a ton, but I have seen chachamim who end up getting to these situations where they're isolated, where they're not beholden to their Rebbe. They don't have a lot of peers. They're just involved in their own world, their own echo chamber of their own ideas. And then that's what leads them to go off, So those are some rules of thumb.
Yeah, very important. Thanks.
Yeah, good question. Okay. So this part I think is just cool. Okay. And this, okay, well, I'll read it first. It is remarkable the character of the pleasure we derive from the best books. They impress us ever with the conviction that one nature wrote and the same reads. We read the verses of one of the great English poets, or of Chaucer, of Marvell, of Dryden, with the most modern joy, with a pleasure, I mean, which is in great part caused by the abstraction of all time from their verses. There is some awe mixed with the joy of our surprise when this poet, who lived in some past world 200 or 300 years ago says that which lies close to my own soul, that which I also had well nigh thought and said. Okay. But for the evidence thence afforded to the philosophical doctrine of the identity of all minds, we should suppose some pre-established harmony, some foresight of souls that were to be, and some preparation of stores for their future wants, like the fact observed in insects who lay up food before death for the young grub they shall never see. Okay, so in other words, what he's saying is, it's a cool thing when you are learning and you stumble upon something that a great thinker said a long time ago that is exactly what you thought in your own learning now, you know? And he's saying that that reinforces the notion that it's the same Tselem Elokim working on the same reality, you know? And it's a good sign. I remember Robbie Schwartz quoted in the name of Rabbi Chait that how do you know that you're on the right track when you're learning? He says that the Rishonim will light up along the way. Like you'll encounter similar views by previous thinkers along the way, you know? That's a good sign that you're on the right track. But you know, this is really what I look for in my learning is like, this is why I love Mishlei, because like when I'm learning Mishlei, I'm finding ideas from Shlomo HaMelech who lived like 3,000 years ago, not exactly, but close to 3,000 years ago. And like, these are ideas that I'm seeing in reality right now, you know? And this is what I'm looking for in all of my learning of like that reality of encountering the idea. And then you see the Chacham who you're learning, encountering the idea, and you're like, yeah, and then you high five across the ages, you know? So it's so I think that is a cool thing about learning, and it also is a testament, or it's an indicator of how man thinking reads. The people who are parroting other people's ideas are not doing that. They're reading and they're like saying the words, and mere thinkers are also not doing that. They're just saying, okay, this is what so and so says. But the real independent thinkers will be learning independently, and then arrive at a real meeting of the minds with thinkers of the past. And like, that's how you know that like you are like on the right track. Okay. So now he starts talking. Yeah.
Just like a small, like that's just also the best feeling though, when like you are learning and you pose an answer and you like develop it, and then you look into the sources and you see like there is somebody that agrees with you. It's just the best feeling. It is.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, I think when a person first starts off learning, like then it's an ego feeling. But then afterwards, it becomes like a relief feeling of like, oh yeah, like I'm on the path of truth, you know, and the ego is not really involved in it. Okay, so now he starts talking about how to read correctly. Okay, and this is going to overlap with some of the ideas we just read. He says, I would not be hurried by any love of system, by any exaggeration of instincts to underrate the book, capital B. Okay, so now he's talking about the good kind of way of relating to the book. We all know that as the human body can be nourished on any food, though it were boiled grass and the broth of shoes, so the human mind can be fed by any knowledge. Okay, side point here. I read this when I was a little kid, that if you were ever stranded on a desert island and you have leather shoes, you should gnaw on the leather because I guess there are nutrients in the leather still that the human body can make use of, like as a survival tactic. Okay, so just, you know, FYI. All right, so he's saying that that like, you know, if you're going to just subsist on books, then it is it's possible. Okay, he says, and great and heroic men have existed who had almost no other information than by the printed page. I would only say that it needs a strong head to bear that diet. Okay, pausing there for 1 second here. This is why writing down Torah Sheba'al Peh was so disastrous. Okay, one of the reasons, right? Because we were forced to do it, but when you write down Torah Sheba'al Peh, you're making the learning dependent on books instead of living minds. You know, in the old system, you would get Chachma directly from meeting the mind of your Rebbe and discussing everything live. And that's why that era produced so many Chachamim. But then the more committed to books there is, then the more like you run into all these problems, these traps with the books. And it's very, very rare that a person can become a Chacham entirely through books, not through any living Rebbe. Okay. So then he says, one must be an inventor to read well, meaning creative. As the proverb says, he that would bring home the wealth of the Indies must carry out the wealth of the Indies. I don't know what that means. There is then creative reading as well as creative writing. When the mind is braced by labor and invention, the page of whatever book we read becomes luminous with manifold illusion. Every sentence is doubly significant, and the sense of our author is as broad as the world. We then see what is always true, that as the seer's hour of vision is short and rare among heavy days and months, so is its record, perchance, the least part of his volume. The discerning will read in his Plato or Shakespeare only that least part, only the authentic utterances of the oracle. All the rest he rejects, were it never so many times Plato's and Shakespeare's. Okay, now the bold part I think is easiest to understand here, which is that, this is the experience we just said. When you have an idea, or your mind is on the cusp of an idea, and then you see it in the Chacham's writings, then you're like, I now know the true significance of that. I'm not just reading words, I'm using those words as a portal into the mind of this author, and we're both beholding the same truth, And what he's saying is you're gonna look for those moments in whatever thinkers you read. And you might read an entire Plato dialogue, and for him, the whole thing was ideas. And for you, it might just be that one line that jumps at you right then, So I think there's a slight difference between this and the Masorah, which is that we do look for this in all the words. We don't just reject the rest, but I do think the phenomenon is true that sometimes I'll read an entire text written by a Chacham, and this one line will jump out at me, and I will functionally leave the rest aside and just take that and run with it, because that's where my mind is primed for right now. Okay.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking, based on what you were saying before, I mean, probably part of the reason is that if you're learning something by a Masorah, orally, then the person teaching it to you will teach you in the right order and in the foundations, and then get to the conclusions, which will be the aha moment. But that might be what, I mean, a person who's writing is kind of shooting in the dark, and they'll put it all out, but they may not do all the developmental stages that will cause you to say, and then,
right.
But
that's
if
true.
they write the conclusion,
right,
you might not be ready for it, and then you're totally out of order, and you're not going to get what they're saying because it wasn't built up in the way where it would have been if you had been learning it orally.
Right. So a good example of that is Plato's dialogues, because for the people who Plato was talking to, then they were like, at every step of the way. We see that's what they had. But if Plato was dialoguing with you, you might have taken the conversation in other directions, and because your mind saw different things, and it would have been a different dialogue, even if it got to the same ideas. And so when we have no choice but to read the words that were written for either a general audience or an audience that's not us, then we have to just settle for whatever happens to coincide with the way that our mind is primed for, and just content ourselves with the fact that it's not tailor-made.
Exactly.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point.
That's why it's the whole idea, I think, of repeating, because whenever you repeat the learning, you'll come back and you'll see things through a different perspective, and you develop like that.
Right, because your mind is in a different place. Right, that's true. Okay, so this is the last part of his section on books. So we're going to read this, and then I need to see if there is a. Hold on just a second. I'm going to mute. Oh, there. Thank you. Okay. We're going to read. Oh, is someone unmuted? Yeah. Oh, there we go. Okay. So we're going to read this last section of books, and then I just want to skim through the rest and see if there's anything that directly relates. Okay. It says, of course, there is a portion of reading quite indispensable to a wise man. Oh, so this is very, very pertinent to the Masorah. He says, history and exact science he must learn by laborious reading. Colleges, in like manner, have their indispensable office to teach elements. Okay, so pause here for a second. So when it comes to an exact science, as opposed to philosophy and psychology and ethics, so in exact sciences, you have no choice but to read and to just absorb the information, right? So I think a great deal of our learning in halacha, especially, is going to involve just laborious reading, where you're not trying to discover stuff on your own. You're just relying on getting the facts. Okay. So that is important. And if you did away with that, you cannot be a historian, a creative historical thinker, without reading lots and lots of laborious facts. Okay. So too, you can't be a Talmid Chacham without reading through a bunch of factual Torah. Okay. But they, meaning this type of reading, can only highly serve us when they aim not to drill but to create, when they gather from far every ray of various genius to their hospitable halls, and by the concentrated fires set the hearts of their youth on flame. Thought and knowledge are natures in which apparatus and pretension avail nothing. Gallant and pecuniary foundations, though towns of gold, can never countervail the least sentence or syllable of wit. Forget this, and our American colleges will recede in their public importance whilst they grow richer every year. Okay, I think this is not due to our shiur. Sorry, this is for if I was going to go on a rant about college. about how colleges have done exactly this. If they've made everything into drills, and drilling factual information as opposed to like setting the hearts of their youth on flame. This is not part of our shiur. But I think, well, okay, maybe it is. I think that yeshivas do this also, and high schools do this also, is they're not, they have made in other words, what he's saying is there are certain areas that you just have to immerse yourself in rote learning of facts, but that should be a means to inflaming your heart and making you a creative thinker. But the mistake that colleges make and that yeshivas make is that they make all of learning into just drilling you, and then it kills the learning and it takes the life out of that and cuts you off from becoming a man thinking, a creative thinker. Let me just quickly, this next part is also good, but it's a different topic. And so this might be the end of what we have here for today. Yeah, the next part he talks about the role of experience in, actually, is this thing? No. Yeah, okay. I advise you to read this all on your own. It's available online. I can send it to you if you want also. But yeah, so what are our takeaways here? So our takeaways are, I think, and then you tell me if I'm missing anything, is we must have Emunas Chachamim, okay, which is conviction that the sages, that Chachamim are Chachamim, okay? How do you tell if they're in that club? That was Avital's question. Easier said than done, okay? But you have to treat them as Chachamim and treat their words accordingly, and like subordinate yourself to their words, not in terms of conclusions or in terms of results, like in terms of like confining yourself there, but in order to understand what they're saying so that you can become an independent thinker, okay? However, you also have to be aware of the danger, which is taking the words of the written words of a chacham and making them into, like Bruce Lee says, the tomb in which the wisdom is buried, and like falling into the trap of just parroting their words or just thinking along their narrow lanes. In other words, subordinate yourself to their words to the point where you can understand them, but not to the point where you limit your own development and limit your own independent thinking. And the trick is to find that balance of how much to subordinate yourself to the words of the Chachamim of past generations and how much to spread your own wings and like become a creative thinker. And I don't know, like, I think the best we've been able to offer like today is like guidelines. And I think there are different guidelines for each part of a person's development. I think when you're in high school or in your first years of learning, post high school, you should err more on the side of subordination because you don't have the skills yet, you don't have the intuition yet. But then as you grow and develop, like the goal of every person is to become man thinking, is to actualize your own Tzelem Elokim. And while you should never lose track of greater Chachamim, and you should always be learning from the Chachamim, dead or alive, you do have to flourish as an independent thinker who sees things on their own. And like, I think if you're reading with that in mind, where you're trying to like meet the minds of these thinkers and see independently arrive at the same, when you see yourself independently arriving at the same conclusions that they did, that shows you're on the right track. And if you independently arrive at a conclusion that they didn't arrive at yet, then, if you've been meeting them along the way, then there's a higher odds that like you've discovered like real truth and aren't off the derech. But it's a balancing act. It's a struggle.
Question?
I had a question.
Yeah. Just factually, would you say that there's a difference in let's say what Bruce Lee is saying in general, because we have a system of Masorah in terms of listening to the people who said things, we know that they're sort of trained through and validated through the system versus just like a random thinker?
Yes, I do. I think, sorry, was that the end of your question?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I do think that it is different because, okay, I'm going to compare it to nature. Okay. So God created nature and then left mankind to figure it out on their own. Okay. Torah is like nature in the sense that it's the word of Hashem, but he gave it with a system to be passed down, So there is a great, so like, in other words, if a scientist, like, maybe that's a bad foot to start off on. Let me start again. Okay, let me start again. Is that I do think the fact that we have a system to pass it down is different and places much more of a premium on like looking into the Chachamim who came before you. And I think the fact that we also have a system in terms of a religion and like a legal system that means that you don't have the freedom to just think and teach whatever you want, as would someone who's just a purely free intellect. Take like the Ikarim, like the lo sasur akar levavchem achrei nechem, al tifnu el ha'alilim. Like there are lots of like even safeguards on what we are and are not allowed to like think about, or like conclusions that we are and are not allowed to reach. So it's not, and that comes from the fact that this is like a system that is meant to perpetuate itself from generation to generation. So I do think it is different than the pure free thinker Bruce Lee thing. Wherein lies the difference? Like where we draw the line, that is less clear to me, but there is a difference.
I had another question.
Sure.
I'm just wondering if you think, like, I guess a more theoretical question, is it like a necessary outcome of really internalizing someone's ideas and derech that you end up producing chidushim and independent thinking of yourself? Or like, can a person just internalize someone else's ideas and thoughts and their conclusions and really understand them, I guess, and not end up, like just don't have the opportunity or not as creative if they don't end up producing, why is not a valid?
It's a great question. I do think, so I would like to believe that this is a thing that automatically happens, that you do become an independent thinker at a certain point of development, but I agree that there are some people who just are not going to get that far, either because of, like, let's say you start learning like when you're 50, like maybe the most you can hope to get is just a really good understanding of what your Rebbe teaches you. So like you might not reach that level of independent thinking, but I think that if you are like, even that, when you've made the teacher's teachings your own, even if you're not coming up with your own derech or your own chidushim, I think there is a personal quality that attaches to the ideas when you've made them your own that is in this sphere. I don't know exactly how to explain it. I think,
I hear that.
There's like, I think experientially, like when you are merely hearing an idea from a teacher versus when you've internalized it, even if you're not adding anything to it, like in terms of like developing the idea even more, it has a certain quality when you've made it your own through your own understanding. And that's like something to be treasured as man thinking.
Right, isn't that of 6 questions when a person dies? One of the questions is chidashta davar mitoch davar, and I think it's what what you're saying of you just do put things together when you hear them based on your own life experience.
That's good. That is love of machadish davar mitoch davar. Yeah. Okay, so I hope this was a valuable exercise in Emunas Chachamim, and again, I encourage you to read the entire speech. Again, it's some of it is a little dense. I don't understand all of it, but it's a great speech. And every time I've read it, it's been very fruitful in terms of my own development. And so I hope this was fruitful for you as well. Have a good Shabbos. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.